Rebecca Boden, who is from the Centre. She's the research director for the new social research program in Tampere University, Finland. Rebecca today is going to talk to us about the research that she's conducted with Julie Rowlands from Deakin University, Australia. And as many of you know, Julie should have been here today, but she's poorly, and we'd all like to send Julie our very, very best wishes and support and hopes for her very speedy recovery. So Rebecca stepped in at the last moment, very kindly, very generously, to come and speak to us today. And those of you who know Rebecca will know that she is a tenacious, astute, and forensically detailed researcher. She came to speak to us in the middle of the strike of the 12th of March this year, just before we went into catastrophic lockdown status in Britain. So you can imagine what the effective climate was like. And we had to relocate Rebecca from a cheer seminar to a NUS teach out, Students' Union teach out space. And it was cold, it was dismal day, and everybody was so anxious about the strike, about the pandemic. And Rebecca generated so much excitement, enthusiasm, quite a bit of rage, not against Rebecca, but against the system that she was forensically theorizing and analyzing. But most of all, we were incredibly grateful to her for her insights and her intellectual capital that she has deployed in the analysis of this very sticky issue. So I'd like to welcome Rebecca today, and to just let everybody know that Rebecca's going to talk for about 30 to 40 minutes. And please she's going to generate a lot of questions. Yeah. So please feed your questions into the chat box as you go. Don't lose those thoughts. And when Rebecca's finished presenting, she's going to respond to your questions. So this will be recorded and it'll be put on the Cheer website along with Rebecca's slides. And as I was joking with Yasser earlier, we better all start looking for other jobs. Okay, welcome Rebecca. Lovely, lovely to have you back in Cheer.
Thank you so much, Louise. And I do look forward to coming to Sussex in normal times. So like maybe third time we'll be lucky. I don't want to kind of, I'm really sorry for creeping you out by putting up this picture of Gavin Williamson, the Secretary of State for Education in England, I should say, to start with. But he's much in the news at the moment with coronavirus. Not just about the school exams fiasco, which certainly my colleagues here in Finland knew all about that. But also around universities, and universities have been there we go. Technology and me don't mix. Particularly around universities, where there's been a great deal of controversy because ill-advisedly, I think there was a decision to try to return to normal teaching in universities, encouraging lots of students to come back. Students in the UK pay very significant fees, around £9,000, €10,000 a year, and a return to face-to-face teaching. And surprise to surprise, there are now, I think, 17,000 infected students in the UK, and a call for students to be given a refund on their teaching. And this has shone a spotlight on what vice-chancellors are doing. And this has been weaponised by the Conservatives, and Laura Trott, a Conservative MP, asked Williamson to consider stop university leaders receiving bonuses this year unless fees were lowered for students having to take online courses. He replied that the question was incredibly important and said excessive vice-chancellor pay remained a problem, and he would ask the higher education regulator for England, the Office for Students, to intervene. I'll be asking for the Office for Students to look at this and give very strong and clear steers on this matter to ensure that there aren't bonuses going out as a result of this crisis. Now, I think this statement by Gavin Williamson exemplifies a lot of what's wrong with Gavin. We could do a whole lecture, to be quite frank, but also higher education generally. So I'm giving him 0 out of 10 for that answer, for that promise. Because whilst he is right to think that Vice-Chancellor's excessive pay remains a problem, he has serially failed to do anything about it. He's also wrong on imagining that university performance has very much at all to do with Vice-Chancellor's pay, and that the Office for Students can do anything about it. Now, it is the case that Vice-Chancellor's pay in Australia and the UK has been an ongoing press imbroglio. So every year, when the figures come out for Vice-Chancellor's pay, we see dramatic headlines about why are these people earning so much, what are we going to do about it, particularly like this one for Liverpool. And the same goes in Australia, where I should tell you an Australian dollars is about $2 to the pound at the moment. So you can see that Australian Vice-Chancellors do even better than the UK ones do. So ongoing press kind of interest in this. And indeed, the figures are quite eye-watering for what their salaries are. So annual UK VC remuneration, 281,000. You can see that during periods of worst austerity from 2011-12 to 2016-17, Vice-Chancellor's pay rose by an average in the UK 3.1% a year, during which time, of course, academic staff were getting subject to a public sector pay cap of 1%. And that picture is even more dramatic in the Russell Group universities, the elite research universities, where even 3 years ago, I should have looked up more recent figures, but it just made me angry. You're getting on towards 350,000, 400,000 pounds average pay. And there is clear evidence of a rapid escalation in the UK VC's pay since compulsory reporting began in 1995. And what's happened in the UK since 1995 is this interests me as an accountant, which is a bit of my biography, Louise missed out, is that since 1995, it's become obligatory for Vice-Chancellors to disclose their remuneration in the annual financial reports and accounts of universities. And that has enabled the Times Higher Education to collect all that data into a very useful time series, which a lot of my more quantitative colleagues have used. Australia doesn't have those kind of reporting requirements, but every year there is similar press coverage of the frankly astoundingly ridiculous salaries that a lot of Australian Vice-Chancellors get. This is the UK. This is from Backen and Riley. Sorry, the source got left off. The 3 lines to concentrate on. The top pale grey one is the pay for chief executive officers of private firms and directors from 1997 to 2009. And it's all been reset to 1998 prices. So there's no effect of inflation in there. And you can see the rise in corporate pay. Below that is Vice-Chancellors, an average of Vice-Chancellors in the UK, and you can see that going up, very similar trend to CEOs. And surprise, surprise, I could have asked you to guess which one was the lecturers. I didn't think you really needed the legend at the bottom, but the heavy dotted line at the bottom is university lecturers. So you can see not only has their pay been growing, but actually it's been growing in relation to academic staff, which means this isn't just about pay in the sector going up, it's about these people's pay going up in relation to their colleagues. And if you want that in a different form, this is average UK VCs and academics pay, adjusted to 2017 prices this time. And the ratio on the right-hand column is the ratio of vice-chancellors' pay to academic pay. So you can see that in 2007, just before the global financial crisis started, VCs earned £4.90 for every pound that the average academic earned. And by 2015, all those years of austerity, VCs were earning £5.70 for every pound that academics earned. And this data all needs updating. I don't have the skills or the motivation to do that, but lots of people do. And you can see the problems. I mentioned that we don't have that kind of data for Australia. So what Julie and I did was look at 3 universities in each of the 3 university sectors: the elite research intensive universities, equivalent to the Russell Group, the mid-level teaching and research universities, and then what we might call in Britain the post-92s. And this is ratios of vice-chancellors' pay to salary, 1975 to 2018. And you can see similar similar kinds of patterns, quite remarkably so at the elite research intensive universities, where the pay ratio has gone up from $2.9 for VC pay for every dollar of academics pay to a quite staggering $16, and that's fairly consistent and depressing. So hang on. Oh, there we go. So we started to think about the ways in which we might explain this what is obviously a very real phenomenon. And the first thing we looked at was the kind of mechanisms by which VC pay might be going up so fast and going up so fast in relation to academic salaries. And we found 2 mechanisms have been identified in the literature as relevant here. The first one is what's called benchmarking, and that's basically, it's a sort of management buzzword these days. It basically means looking at the performance of your organisation and pay levels and so on, and then picking a comparator organisation and putting yourself in the same kind of company. So if your vice-chancellor is on $300,000 a year and the vice-chancellor down the road at a very comparable university is on $400,000, then you're underpaying your VC and you should give him or her a big pay rise. So that's benchmarking. The second one is what economists call tournament theory. And tournament theory is basically that there's always going to be a pay hierarchy. And so if the big boss gets a big pay rise because the big boss down the road has got a pay rise, then all the people under the big boss should be sucked up in his or her wake. So the tournament should be a steady progression of salary up through an organisational hierarchy. And of course, and this is quite pertinent for universities, if you start hiring people in from outside with corporate skills, they might earn quite a lot more, and that disrupts the pay hierarchy and pushes everybody up because those people get a lot of money. And the existing literature from the econometricians suggests that both benchmarking and tournament theory are factors in these pay hikes. But to be honest, these are just tools that organisations use to determine salary settings, you know, what's an appropriate rate. And they don't explain the power dynamics that lead to this. And it sort of shows the limitations of quantitative research, but it does give a kind of technocratic answer to why their pay is going up. Oh, it's benchmarking and tournament, sort of pay tournaments, but it's not enough. So the next thing we thought about was, you know, maybe all of these vice-chancellors are superheroes. I particularly like this picture of Superman because it looks vaguely like Gavin Williamson. And maybe their pay is going up so much because they're doing such a fantastic job in universities. Now, there's a long tradition in the finance literature of looking at private firms and sort of looking at directors' executives' pay and seeing how well it is linked to corporate performance. And the overwhelming answer is it's very unusual for executive pay to be linked to corporate performance. They have all kinds of statistical tricks of ways of testing this that, quite frankly, I don't understand. I probably don't want to. And they've done the same with vice-chancellors' pay, because a lot of these finance professors are also disgruntled university professors, and they found the same thing. So the econometric studies find no or very weak correlation between the increases in vice-chancellors' pay and increases in universities' performance across a range of measures. So there was no ready answer there. So we started to dig in and we looked at what is this remuneration they're getting? Maybe we need a different approach to understanding what is going on here. And we went back to some very basic economics around remuneration. And basically, organisations have resources and they tend to distribute those resources to individuals who are in some way associated with that organisation, who they hope will make some contribution to it. And so remuneration gets defined as the money and the non-monetary perks, things like company cars or pension schemes, that an individual receives because of their personal relationship with an organisation. And there's 4 types of relationship. The first one is profits, and profits is what goes to the owners of for-profit organisations, private firms, basically. And it's a reward for them risking their capital. They invest their money into a business. Often they invest somebody else's money into a business, and they get profits back as their reward for that under a basic capitalist model. We don't need to worry about profits here because universities are not-for-profit organisations. The second form is stipends, which is money paid non-contractually to facilitate a beneficial relationship with an organisation. And the best example we have, of course, is a grant or a bursary to a research student. So someone you want around the organisation, and you make them a gift of money in order that they cooperate with and work with your organisation. The third one is salaries and wages, which is going to be the most familiar, which is the contractual payment for labour given or services performed. So that's the money you get for doing work under contract within an organisation. The fourth one is a bit more complicated, and rent I'm using here in a very limited economic sense, is rent, or the ability to take rent, is the ability to extract value from an organisation, take some cash out basically, without actually contributing to the value of the organisation. And this kind of concept developed looking at kind of feudal aristocrats who owned vast estates, and they allowed the peasants to farm and then extracted rent from the peasants in terms of the crops or money or whatever. And feudal aristocrats didn't contribute any value to that farming organisation, but they were able to extract value because they owned and controlled the land. And that concept can be applied into all organisations, that sometimes if you own and control something, it gives you the ability to take out more than you are contributing in terms of your efforts or anything else. And obviously, those are the 4 types of remuneration, and organisations have finite resources. And the more that goes out in one type of remuneration, the less there is to another group. And the one we'll be familiar with best, I guess, is in a private firm, the more you pay the executives, or the more you pay the workers in salaries and wages, the less profit there will be, and therefore the lower the dividend to the owners. So you can see that kind of competition for remuneration that happens within organisations. So what determines the allocation between these types of resources is the governance form of the organisation, and that's the rules for decision making. And through governance, we decide, well, how are we going to allocate our resources in order to encourage the right kind of organisational activities. So if we're a firm, do we need to pay higher salaries, or maybe give the workers a profit share in order to encourage them to work harder for the owners? So governance plays a big part in this kind of decision making. And there's two principal forms of decision making that Julie and I talk about in the paper. The first one is what's called stewardship, which is a very old-fashioned notion. Stewardship comes from the idea that feudal aristocrats would appoint stewards, who are basically their estate managers. A steward was an estate manager, and the steward didn't do it for a big fat salary. He did it out of feudal loyalty to his lord. And it's as this nice quote here says, you know, that notion of stewardship has been carried through into contemporary kind of corporate governance, and it's characterized as saying that individual behavior can be ordered such that pro-organizational collectivistic behaviors have higher utility than individualistic self-serving behaviors, even where the interests of the steward and the principal, that's the boss, are not aligned. The steward places higher value on cooperation than defection. So this is the notion that people carry on working in organizations because they feel a sense of allegiance and loyalty and commitment to them. And it's very much this notion of service. And this notion of stewardship, which, as I say, comes from feudal times, got carried through in ideas around corporate governance, although it wasn't called that then, until about the interwar years. The sort of 1930s is when this notion of stewardship broke down. And stewardship is really about the social relations that govern a relationship within an organisation and motivate people to work for the organisation. And in university terms, a lot of writers, and Julie and I included, really equate stewardship with old-fashioned collegiality. This is the Master and Fellows of University College, Oxford in early 18th century. And I think we'd argue that this notion of collegiality, which is a form of stewardship, really prevailed in the UK and Australia until about 30 years ago. And people got their rewards, they got their kicks, they did it because of status and kudos and a sense of loyalty to their organisation. Now, I said that companies continued with this form of stewardship governance until the 1930s. Problematically, around about the 1930s, companies sort of changed their form, really. It used to be the owners would work alongside their managers, and much the same way that feudal lords would work with their stewards, their estate managers. But then companies started to sell shares, and mass share ownership became quite prevalent. And at that point, those very close personal social relationships between owners and managers started to break down, because the owners could be spread over several continents, they would be a long way away, they would never meet the managers. And so you got a distancing and deterioration of those social relationships. And with it, it's argued, came a breakdown of the social control that came with stewardship. And basically this separation of ownership and control, it's been argued since the 1930s, handed a lot of power to managers, because they didn't have the owners in the same factory, in the same office the whole time watching them. So, so it was like, oh, what do we do about that? And out of that kind of problem, that managers started accreting a lot of power to themselves, we got the birth of what's called agency theory. And again, agency here is being used in a very specific kind of economistic finance type way. And under agency theory, well, that sees owners as principals, and it sees managers as their agents. And because it's kind of comes out of the Chicago Finance School, agency theory sees both groups, the owners, the capitalist owners, the shareholders, and the managers, the executives, as trying to maximize their own financial position at the expense of the other. The manager wants the biggest possible salary. The owner wants the biggest possible profit, so they get a lot of dividend. And as I say, there's an obvious conflict there. And along from the Chicago School in the 1970s came Jensen and Meckling, who were two financial economists. And they argued, oh, the answer to this problem is easy. You can mitigate this conflict in two ways. First of all, the principals the owners could institute costly governance systems that delimit, control, and monitor the actions of the agents. So basically, you set up very, very stringent systems for watching what your executives are doing and controlling them to make sure that they're working in your best interest. And the option number two, which they preferred, is that you say, well, then the managers are motivated by money, so let's align their interests with the owner's interests by giving them a share in the wealth they create. So let's give them things like profit-related bonuses, because then we can if we tell them that they get a cut of the money that they make for me, that's going to motivate them to make a lot more money for me. These guys became very rich out of this stuff, by the way. Jensen and Meckling. So remuneration, they argue, is the most cost-effective way to protect shareholders, protect owners' interests, because it costs less than all that surveillance, and also it frees up the managers to behave entrepreneurially. You don't want your managers sort of feeling they have to look over their shoulder the whole time. You want them to take risks and behave entrepreneurially. And the important thing here is the salary, the remuneration, the reward you give to the managers isn't necessarily the same as the value of the work they put in. It's just that's the price you have to pay to buy them off. It's the optimal point between the cost of watching them and the cost of motivating them through money. So already we're into, this isn't really a reward for work done. So that's the agency sort of theory and stewardship theory, and there's a nice sort of way in which we can contrast these two things. One is that, first of all, is motivation. So under agency, we get measurable extrinsic motivations like money, and in stewardship, it's all about your sense of belonging with the organisation. Second one is identification. The steward identifies very personally with the organisation. It's part of them. And for the agent, strictly mechanistic, how much money do I get out of it, and self-serving. The third is power. So in a stewardship, the power comes through that personal expert and referent, and it comes through knowing stuff and expertise that comes through personal relationships. With agency, it's much more coercive, structural power. You're appointed to a position in the organisation to do particular things. Another point of distinction is trust, in that stewards are people, by definition, you trust. Whereas with agency, you don't trust your managers, and you seek to control them, either through watching them or, more preferably, through motivating them through money. Culture is different. Stewardship systems tend to be collectivists, and agency systems tend to be individualistic because everyone's out for their own benefit. And finally, the power distance varies quite markedly, in that stewardship is marked by lower power distance relationships than agency ones. so the much flatter agency, it becomes much more important to have hierarchies because your position in the hierarchy tends to be what justifies your pay. So Julie and I, we thought, well, what we've got kind of is this shift in governance forms, and that followed a shift in kind of corporate structures in the UK and indeed in Australia. And we thought, let's look at the corporatisation of universities in Australia and the UK and look at their transformation and see if it's been through a similar path. Australia first, very briefly. Australia has 38 comprehensive publicly funded universities. These are self-governing, self-owning charities, so they're not private firms, they're not-for-profit entities. Since the 1950s, most of the funding has come from the federal government. Australia is a federal country, of course. And in the 1980s, quite interestingly, there was a shift, and you'll see in a minute, it was the same as the UK, a reduction of direct control of the internal businesses of higher education institutions, which signalled a Thatcher-like commodification of the tertiary education system. So mid-1980s, marked shift towards corporatising universities. VCs at this point were expected to become chief executive officers of universities and more business-like and more entrepreneurial. The balance of internal power in Australian universities reverted sharply to university councils away from their academic senates. So you see this real shift of who's allowed to make decisions and who's allowed to do stuff and decide stuff. At the same time, the councils became much smaller and more focused on strategic and financial matters. They became interested in the business end of thing, and the business end of thing became the powerhouse of decision-making in universities. And senior external business people were appointed to the councils, and there was a concomitant reduction in staff and student numbers on councils. So you can see a real governance shift of power. So universities become more openly corporatist to deliver greater accountability to government because they were spending government money. And perhaps unsurprisingly, this led to a shift in what was happening on the salary front. So from 1974 to the 1990s, academic staff salaries, so ordinary lecturers and so on, were centrally determined. And then in the 1990s was replaced by a decentralised local enterprise bargaining system, which gave the management greater control locally over rewards. So they can say, well, if you're in this subject, we like that better, we'll give you more money. From 1976 to 86, interestingly, in Australia, there was a central pay award body which recommended vice-chancellors' salaries. And if the universities didn't keep to those recommendations, the universities were fined. And there's real evidence of those fines actually biting and being effective. So basically, a government body dictated what vice-chancellors' salaries were, and if the universities didn't fall into line, they suffered financially. But then from the late 1980s, along with this corporate transformation, VC's pay became set entirely within each university. So that central direction of vice-chancellors' salaries stopped as vice-chancellors, as universities were encouraged to enter the sort of private sector type operations and become corporatized. And surprise, surprise, this is, happens in the UK as well. Vice-chancellors started to sit and now sit quite consistently on their own remuneration committees, which decide their pay. Very quickly, the UK, I'm assuming you're more familiar with this, obviously universities started as and remain autonomous self-governing communities of scholars. Apart from a small group of more recent sort of commercial for-profit institutions, they remain charitable and self-governing, so they don't have any owners, they're self-owning. And until the 1990s, marked by a culture of trust and a significant absence of managerial control or mechanisms or formal exogenous accountability. Academics were the primary decision makers in collegial governance through senates, and vice-chancellors were primus inter pares, the first amongst equals. So they were one of us. From the 19th century to the 1980s, the state increasingly funded universities and took a very careful decision not to get involved in the university, in the governance of universities, in decision making. That ended with Margaret Thatcher, and principally the Committee of Vice-Chancellors and Principals, now the Universities UK organisation, published a Jarrett report in 1985, which recommended the whole-scale corporatisation of universities. And this was in the midst of a massive recession and swinging austerity under the Thatcher government. Crucial to this sort of Jarrett Committee recommendations was that the Vice-Chancellor was not only an academic leader, but also chief executive of the university. And council's power was increased at the expense of senates. So this is exactly parallel to what's happening in Australia. And universities have increasingly prioritised corporate efficiency and profitability, shifting the balance of power further to senior non-academic managers. So two countries, exactly the same kind of transformations, and lo and behold, we've got the same kind of stuff happening on salaries. So in 2018, 95% of vice-chancellors were either members of their remuneration committee that set their own salaries or allowed to attend their meetings. This largely continues. The Committee for University Chairs of Councils in 2018 introduced a voluntary code which said they shouldn't really be members, but they can go and attend as long as they're not in the room when their own salary is discussed. Which strikes me as a pretty weak form of control. And by 2019, some 81% of UK universities still allowed their VC to attend remuneration committee meetings. 9 still allowed the Vice-Chancellor to vote in committee meetings. What does this mean? I'm just winding up now. What we've seen in university governance is a shift from collegial to corporate forms that's been accompanied by a shift in governance from those collegial stewardship forms to agency forms. So in many ways, what's happened in the universities as they've corporatized has mirrored what happened over a longer period in the private corporate sector. Professional management functions have come to the fore in both countries. And vice-chancellors see themselves and are seen by others as chief executive officers, as business people, as business leaders. And they adopt the rhetoric of that. We've also seen, perhaps unsurprisingly, a significant uptick in VC remuneration over this period, which seems to be driven by benchmarking and paid tournaments. And vice-chancellors and their representative bodies justify this remuneration with a kind of agency rhetoric. So many of you will be familiar, every time there's a latest news headline of the sort I showed at the beginning about huge increases in VC pay, you find the kind of things like, well, universities are large and complex organisations, and they're international organisations delivering significant value, and pay is objectively set through benchmarking mechanisms. So these are market salaries. So that's where we've got to. So in many ways, the universities and the vice-chancellors wrap themselves in this agency rhetoric of, well, we've got to pay these people because they're business leaders, and this is the way the system works. They never mention that actually all the evidence shows that in the corporate sector, pay does not necessarily lead to performance. So the reason, we need to consider why this isn't working. Why is it that there's no link between pay and performance? These people's pay keeps going up, but we're not getting the performance. And the first reason for it really is that universities have an important difference from firms in that they don't have any owners. And you could argue that there are principals, there are people who are responsible, ultimately control the organisation, because ownership and control are two sides of the same coin, really. And you could say that university councils are you know, legally and technically principals, so they stand as shareholders would in an organisation. The trouble is, they're very weak in agency terms because they're not legal owners and they are financially disinterested. An extra 10, 20, 50,000 pounds on the Vice-Chancellor's pay doesn't mean that the council members get less, because they don't get anything to start with, or they get very minimal kind of token kind of fees for attending meetings. So you've not got the same kind of thing that you've got in private firms, where every £50,000 extra to a corporate executive is £50,000 less to the shareholders. So there's no legal interest, there's no financial interest on the part of councils to constrain Vice-Chancellors' pay. To make matters worse, they've kind of made a rod for their own back in that they've entrepreneurially empowered the VCs, who can and do argue very vociferously in their own cause in their remuneration committees that they sit on or they attend. So you could argue, and we do argue, that councils as the sort of de jure principles have effectively lost control of remuneration committees and the salary setting process. And it's, as many of you know me, it's rare for me to quote Mike Shattuck, but it's a nice quote from Mike Shattuck from a Times Higher piece here, who says this goes further. He says, there is a tendency to want to have a highly paid Vice-Chancellor because it shows what an important job I'm doing as a lay governor, says Shattuck, who also believes that the inexorable rise of university leaders' salaries is to some extent caused by laziness. Governors do not want to go through the hassle of appointing a new Vice-Chancellor, so they make sure they give the existing one a little more each year. And then we've got a second problem with principals, in that government could legitimately act as the principals of universities, because still, even through the student fee system, most funding for universities is still public money. And so it's legitimate to argue that government sort of stands in the shoes of shareholders, in that they're the people with the ultimate interest in the organisation. But the trouble is, in both Australia and the UK, it's abrogated that responsibility because it likes to pretend that higher education is a market and therefore it can't do anything about it. So you have Gavin Williamson saying, well, I'll tell the Office for Students to give a steer, because that's all he can do. He has no real power or control. And a second and related reason why this is happening is that many VCs sit on their own university's remuneration committee, so they have direct access to power and decision making, and it's such a glaring, awful governance failing, and one that universities have not effectively tackled, either in Australia or the UK. So not only is there a sort of failure of the power of the principals, but you're allowing the people who can benefit most to have a huge voice in the process that sets their salary. And to be quite frank, it's just not good enough saying they go out the room when they're voting on my pay, you know. And our ultimate conclusion really is that Vice-Chancellors are actually a rentier class. Rentiers are people who make money from rent. They are the perhaps I shouldn't say this word, the parasites in the system. I said previously, in agency systems, remuneration always exceeds economically justified wage in agency systems because it's designed to be at that optimal point of the trade-off between the costs of surveillance and the costs of rewarding them through money. So you can argue with VCs, and we do, that remuneration that they get, part of it is salary for doing the job, but the excess, that part that's extra, is actually rent. They're not contributing to the organisation, but they're getting that share of resources out. And the rent arises from having the opportunity through ownership or control of the organisation, and they don't have ownership, but they do have control. So that allows them to extract that rent. And finally, it's clear that large salaries have not been successful in aligning universities and their affected public interest with those of their agents. So we pay huge amounts of money in comparative terms to vice-chancellors, and no evidence whatsoever that really the interests of universities and the interests of the public have been satisfactorily aligned with those of the vice-chancellors. No evidence that we're doing the job this way. And these people are effectively controlling universities for their own ends. And I can talk more about that in questions, perhaps. Agency has two approaches: controlling agents through surveillance or rewarding them. Well, we argue that the reward side isn't working. And so one way forward might be to have more direct regulatory control by government of vice-chancellor pay levels, in the way in which they did in Australia for those sort of 10 years in the 70s and 80s. Problematically, Gavin Williamson doesn't seem to have any real desire to do that. And secondly, it doesn't resolve the underlying weaknesses in university governance that this episode has exposed. So I started with Gavin Williamson, and I'll maybe end with him. This is really a kind of crisis for governments, for Gavin and his counterpart in Australia to resolve by decisive action, but they will experience great difficulty in doing that because they have been busy talking about universities as effectively private operators and commercial operators, and it becomes very difficult, particularly for right-wing conservative governments, which both Australia and the UK have, to break with that. Okay, I'll stop there. I think I'm almost just about kept to time, I hope.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. That was wonderful.